Hi guys, in this video I'm going to show you how to create like a basic crude REST API using the NKit toolkit. Okay, and obviously .NET and Entity Framework. So these are basically this is like an overview of what we'll be doing. So we're going to create the projects and add dependencies. We're going to configure the app and settings and startup and program classes. Then we will create a basic model for users. We're going to store users in the database, and then we'll be creating a database repo in case we need any sort of custom queries. And then we'll create a mobile controller, which is the API itself. Okay, right. So let's get started with creating the project. So I'm going to start by creating a whole new solution. Okay. So I'm going to go create new project, and we're going to look for ASP.NET Core API. That's the one. Okay, and I'm going to call it just crude API. Okay, and I'm going to save it in my repository over there. So this you'll be able to find on GitHub. I'll post that on GitHub. Okay, I'm going to put it in there. And I'm going to go next. Okay, we're going to leave HTTPS alone for now. Everything else we'll leave as is. And I'm going to say create. All right, so here we've got our project. There's a couple of things that we can remove from here. So the sample project from Visual Studio will give you like some basic controller, and I think this is like a basic model. So we're going to get rid of these. Okay. And what we will do is we'll start off by adding the dependencies. We're going to go add dependencies, and we're going to say manage NuGet packages. And we're going to start off by adding the NKit dependencies. Okay, so we'll start with the NKit standard library. We'll install that. Accept. Okay, and then we'll install the .NET Core one, the NKit Core. So the NKit Core is dependent on the NKit standard. Okay. So by the way, the NKit standard will run on .NET standard libraries. So it's compatible with .NET standard libraries, and the NKit Core is compatible with .NET Core apps. Okay, the NKit Windows is for the old .NET framework. Okay, but we'll be using the core in this project. Okay, cool. So if we go over here, we can remove for now the program stuff. We'll set this up later. We're going to remove this HTTP file. We don't need that. Okay. And what we'll do is we'll create a couple of projects. So we'll create a project for the models. So we'll look for class library. You don't have to do it this way, but I like to separate my libraries this way. So basically, I have a class library for the models, another class library for the database queries, like the DB repo. So that would be your data context and entity framework, and then I'll have like a separate project just for the API. Okay, so I'm going to call this crude API.models. Okay, and here we'll create all of our models. So the models are basically your database tables, right? And I'm going to add the same dependencies over here. NKit. Okay, I'm going to add this dependency as well, the .NET Core. Great. And then I'll create one more project for my database repo. Okay, so class library, crude API.data. We'll call it just .data. Okay, cool. So we've got our classes over there. And then we're going to add a dependency. So we're going to say right click and say add project reference. We're going to add these two new libraries as dependencies on our main project. And that's it. Cool. Now, what we need to do is we need to set up our settings. So you'll see here you've got development settings, which is when you're running in debug mode in Visual Studio. And then in production, these will be your settings, right? Okay. Now, there's a couple of settings here, but I normally just copy and paste them from an existing project. So what we'll do is we'll set up the development one, and I'll take it from one of my existing apps. Okay. So we need to configure the NKit settings. Okay, so we'll start off by, we can remove that. And we'll take everything from logging all the way up to that. So everything that you see with NKit. Okay, so every project you do with NKit, you're going to have these settings. Okay, so there I have it. And then I'm going to change my application name. So these are your general settings. I'm going to call this crude API service. And you have to give it a port number over here and your website homepage URL. So if someone wants to hit the web page on the homepage and see what the controllers and actions you have available, you're going to go to this homepage, right? And you'll see how we set this up. Okay, so we're going to use port 5006, and when we run the service, it's going to be hosted by the Kestrel web server, like the built-in .NET Kestrel server. Okay, then what we also need to do is we need to configure a provider, which in this case will be SQL Server. So we're telling NKit which database provider to use. And then what we'll do is we have to tell it which library is our data library. So in this case, this is the library that will contain our migrations. And you'll see what I mean by migrations. So migrations is basically like a script that auto-creates the database for you when the application runs. Here we need to say where our models are located. So our models are in this library over there. Okay. Okay. Here we're going to put in our transaction types. What kind of transactions? So these are basic .NET transactions. The data scope, whether it's required, isolation level, read committed, the transaction timeout in seconds, which is 30, which is different than your database timeout. Okay, but this is a topic of a different subject. So here we say how many times we NKit must retry a transaction if it fails, and the deadlock retry wait period. Okay, but these are all topics of a different discussion. All right. Then finally, this is the logging section. So everything that we do in NKit gets logged in the Windows event log as well as the text file. And you can configure whether you want to log to a file, a log to Windows event log, whether you want to log to the console, etc., etc. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to change this to CRUD API. Okay, so that's the Windows event source and log name. That's the text file that it would log under, but we're not logging to file in this case. And then the different colors that you want to see in the console. So like warnings would be logged as yellow, critical errors would be red, and debug entries would be blue. Okay. Then finally, your email notifications. What you want the email notifications to be sent out from. So I'm using an SMTP server, which I use for testing, and any emails that occur that would basically be emailed through this SMTP server. Okay, and through the exception handler. All right, so I'm going to change this to CRUD API. Change that to CRUD API, and I'll leave that as is. All right, cool. So that's your settings file. So these are just default settings that you have to give to NKit. Right. Now, what we do is okay. So now the next step is we're going to create our models. So in here, I'm going to create a new class. So this model is going to represent a database table, right? So I'm going to call it user because we want to store users in this example. Okay. And there we go. And you can inherit. So if you look at another project, for example, we're going to inherit from NKit base model, right? Okay, which is part of the NKit framework, and it's just a couple of utilities that are included in that for easy usage. Okay, then what I'll do is I'll create a couple of properties. So I'm going to say user ID, which is good. It's going to be a UUID in the database. Okay, and I'm going to make it required. Okay, and I'm going to make it a key, a primary key, or rather a surrogate key. Okay, and then I'll create another one for username, and another one for password. And then maybe I'll just create one for a date created. Okay. Just like that. Okay, cool. And I think it's column. Let's just have a look. Column type. Okay. I'll make that date time. So this is just the constant that's available on the NKit base model. So if you have a look at that, it's basically that date time. And you can use different date times or different values if you want to change the default data types that Entity Framework will create. Okay. and that's part of the NKit base model. All right, cool. So we've got our model. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add a reference here from to the models. So the data library needs to know about the models in order to interact with the database. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a whole new class, and we're going to call it DB repo. Okay, and this is going to be our database repository. That's responsible for doing any queries. It's responsible for setting up the database, etc., etc. And there's another class that you can extend, which is NKit DB context. It's also that provides basic crude functionality under the hood. So if we decompile that and we have a look at it, we've got a couple of different nice utility classes that we can use here. Like we can run raw SQL queries against it. We can save a class. So we can say, it'll take any sort of entity that's available in the database. So any model, and it will save it to the database, and it does everything for us without us having to do anything. We can do inserts, etc., etc. We can insert async, insert, etc., etc. Okay. We've also got like helper classes in here, like get entity by surrogate key. So if a class like this one has a surrogate key, which is key and required, and it's good, it will find, so you just pass in the type, and it will find the record in the database based on its surrogate key. You can also check whether something is of an identity column, you can update an original. There's lots of different delete async, etc., etc. So all of these are available as part of the crude NKit context. All right. Okay, cool. So we're going to implement the constructor. Okay. I'll do that. Now, as you can see, when I create the constructor for an NKit DB context, it provides me with the standard settings available. So these are the settings that we plugged in here. Okay, so when you create an NKit DB context, you need to have these settings set up. So what it will do is through dependency injection, when it constructs a DB repo, it will plug in these settings. Okay, so those are the dependencies, and we're going to register those in the startup class later on. Okay, so here we've got our DB repo. Great. Okay, now you've also got like an email client that you can use for sending out emails and lots of other things. Right, now let's have a look at what we need in the DB repo class. We need to basically register our tables with the entity framework. So this is like standard entity framework stuff. So let's create a region here for tables, and we're going to go public, virtual, and we're going to create a DB set, and we're going to call it user. Okay. Right, so there we go. So now we're telling Entity Framework that this is a table that we would like. Okay, created, and so that's our model that we created. Okay, it's standard Entity Framework stuff. Let's see what else. So we also need to override the onConfiguring. So we're going to go region methods. So this is like a method that gets called by Entity Framework when creating the DB repo. So you're going to say override on configure, override on configuring. There we go. Okay, and if we want to see detailed errors, we enable it like that. Okay, then this is very important. So this is where we set up the database. When we run the app, it's going to set up the database with the parameters we're providing here. Right, so we're going to override the on model creating, on model creating. Okay, so again, this is a method that gets called by Entity Framework when you run the app. Okay, here you can set the foreign key rules to cascade or not cascade, or etc. when you delete a parent, or whether to set the relation the child to null, and so on. Okay, so that's a SQL topic for another day, but that's basically what we do there. We're going to call that in here. Okay, so this is basically you're setting up your database and all the different rules in that. You also want to set like table indexes. So you might go, let's create another class here, another method for setting up the table indexes. And this is how you would basically set up an index. I'm going to let's take the user one as an example. Okay. Set table indexes. Okay, cool. Okay, we don't have an email address on this one. Okay, so that's how you set up the index on a table. So you say, the username on my model needs to be unique. And that's pretty much it. I don't think there's much more we can do. I mean, there's a lot of other data you can set up. You can also set up a SQL default types. So I like to keep the default of strings to SQL varchar 50. So I'm going to set that there. Okay. All right. And you can go in detail. I'm not going to explain every single line of code. Okay, you can also seed the data, etc. But I'm not going to seed any data for now. Or actually, in fact, let's seed some users. So this will create a couple of users when we run the app for the first time. So I'm going to say maybe let's do that. Okay, so we don't need any of this. Okay, so it's going to create a couple of users. Just an admin and a default user. I'll call this defaults. All right. And we're going to seed users model builder. Okay. Yeah, so when it's updating the database, it will go and create the users the first time the app runs. So it will make sure that this data exists in the database. Okay. User. User. Art models. Okay. Cool. So all of this code will run when the application runs for the first time. Okay, let's see what it's complaining about. Okay, so we don't have a main method. Okay, so now we set up the DB repo. We're done with that. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to create the program class. Or no, let's start with the startup class. Okay, so the startup class in .NET Core is normally used to configure your services and register services. Okay, so in other words, we register these sort of things, like all of these are services or classes available in the dependency injection container, so that whenever we need them throughout the application, we can just pull them in. Okay, but for .NET Core to know that they exist, we need to register them, right? So we do that in a startup class, and we're going to create a startup class. Startup. Okay. Right. Okay. Now I'm just going to copy and paste from my startup class. Okay. All of this is documented by Microsoft and stuff, so you don't. So I don't want to go into all the details of what is required here. Okay. Okay, so here we've got the startup, and it's going to receive a configuration from .NET Core when it first gets created. Okay, now this service configurator is a class that we need to create, okay, where we tell the system what services we want enabled and what services we don't want enabled. So if I go into, I'm going to have to create this class, right? So instock.services. So I'm going to go and create this service configurator. Okay. And these are basically just helper methods in terms of what I want registered in NKit and what I don't. So okay. Okay. Now, as part of doing this, okay, so these are default NKit services that we need to register. Okay, so we could have put everything in the startup class, but I just have this separate service configurator class just to bundle everything that I'm doing in terms of registering services. Okay, and NKit has an extension method here that allows us to register all the services in one go. So what it's doing here is it registers all the NKit settings. That's how we know that the settings exist. This is how we are able to read from the settings file over there. Okay, so we need to set that up. Okay, and then finally we need to register the services themselves. So the DB repo we just created, this is how NKit knows which database context to use to connect to the database. And then finally it's these two as well that we also need to create. So the email sender, this is where if we want to send emails, and you can do custom emails and things like that, and you inherit from the NKit email service client. Okay, so that is in the services library over there. Okay, so I'm going to create another class, and I'm going to call it email sender. going to inherit from NKit email service. There we go. And I just need to implement the constructor. All right. And on that logo, I'm going to put it like that. Right. Now, cool. All right. So now we've got our email service over there, which is great. Now all we need is the logging manager. We need to set up that. And this is also very basic. We're going to create another class. We're going to call it logging manager. Okay. And we need to I think it's this guy. Yeah, okay. So the logging manager logs everything. It basically it's used by the exception handler to be able to log and to send emails behind the scenes. So we need to tell it which class is our DB repo, which in that case is that, and which class is our email sender. Okay, right, that's it. And then we need to implement the constructor. Okay. Okay, cool. So now we've got our logging manager. So this should build. Okay, cool. So in our service configure NKit services, this will register all the default NKit services. And that's how we are able to read that settings file and set up the DB repo, email sender, logging manager, etc., etc. And if you look at the email sender, I'm not going to do it in this sample app, but you can go and you can build your own custom email sending, and all of that will be handled by the underlying NKit service if you just want to send an email. So sending custom emails becomes very simple. Like you literally just write this, and it will set it up, and you can do that with HTML emails or text emails. So under the hood, NKit will go and do the actual SMTP client setup and the whole shebang. You literally just need to write like this code and give it the contents basically, and it will send the email for you. And the settings that it gets is from the email settings here. So yeah. So you don't need to worry about the implementation of actually sending the email. It'll grab it from the settings over there. Okay, cool. Right, okay, so we've got that. We've got our email. Okay. Now, any custom services that you want, you can then register in a separate method, or you can set it up in a separate method if you like. Okay. So in our application, we don't have any custom services at the moment. So I'm not going to implement this in our project. The only thing I'm going to implement is the configure Swagger services, because I do want Swagger. Okay. So Swagger is used to see a definition of all the API actions available. So if you go in your URL, once we've finished developing this, and someone goes to this URL, 5006 API, they're going to see a Swagger web page that lists all the actions available on the API, so that you can advertise it and people can try it out without you having to give them sample code and stuff like that. They can just go onto the website, click, download, or get, or do whatever and post JSON requests and whatever to that API. Okay, cool. So we've set up the Swagger here, but in order to do that, there's another dependency that we need to add. So this has actually got nothing to do with NKit or any of that. Okay, so I'm going to add a dependency from NuGet, swashbuckle ASP.NET Core. I just want to make sure I'm using the same version. Okay, yeah, okay, swashbuckle ASP.NET Core. So it should work with the later version as well. I haven't tested this, but let's have a look. Okay, cool. So this, okay, and that's that. All right. So these are our utility classes. We could have put, like I said, we could have put all of this in the startup class, but I just like having it in a separate class just to keep it simple. So I have it in a service configurator class. Right, now over here, okay, we don't need this, so this would be your custom. So I would suggest you create another method like this for your custom services when you're building your app. But at the moment, we don't have any custom services. So I'm going to remove that. Okay, here we are calling that Swagger, so that swashbuckle library that we just installed, and we're just providing basic information, what to show when that web page gets open. So I'm going to say crude API service. That's what they're going to see, an API that allows for interfacing with the data contained in the crude API database. There we go. And now that I think of it, I don't think we configured a database. So we need to set up a connection string in here. So I'm going to call it crude API. This is my connection string to my database. This database will get created when we run the application. Okay. Then we have the add Razor runtime compilation. Okay, so this is basically to allow the Razor pages. If you're building a ASP.NET MVC web application with web pages and stuff like that, and you want those web pages to be rebuilt at runtime. So as you're debugging the app, you can go and change the HTML and see the code changes. You need to enable this. And in order to do that, we need to add another dependency. So we're going to go to manage NuGet packages. So for the purpose of the API that we're building now, we don't actually need to worry about this because we're not going to have any web pages. But I will set it up nonetheless. Okay. Okay. So okay, I don't want to waste too much time on this if it's not really needed for this demo. Okay. The same with this unobtrusive Ajax. So this is for web pages if you're using Ajax, which is what I do in some of my projects. Okay. Here we also set up the authentication type. So we add a cookie, and here we set up the cookie time span. If we're using cookies to log in and log off, etc. But again, that's past the point of this demo. Okay. Now, finally, in the configure method, we just need to pass in the DB repo over there. Here we configure Swagger. Okay, so that's basically what we see in Swagger. So we're going to show here crude API service. Here's Swagger AI. All right, and the rest of the stuff is like authentication, what kind of authentication you want to use, blah blah blah. But these are .NET Core sort of functionality, so you don't need to worry about it too much. Okay, so for the purpose of this demo, all we really need to set up are these things: NKit services. Okay, everything else is .NET related, which you can Google and figure it out yourself. Okay. Cool. Now, finally, what we need to do is create a program class where we run the actual service. So this will be the entry point of our application. So again, I'm just going to copy and paste from one of my existing projects. Okay. And I like to run it as either a console app or as a Windows service. And in a separate video, I'll show you how to run things as a Windows service as well. So let's just namespace crude API. All right, cool. Create web host builder. Sorry about that. We actually need the entire program class. Okay, there we go. Okay, and then what we also need to do is, so if you have a look here, this is where we create our web host builder. But if we're running it from so we create the web host builder if we're running it without any parameters. But we can also run it, so if we're running without any parameters, it's going to run the web host builder, which will basically start up the Kestrel server and so on. And we're telling it here to use our startup class that we created, right? And to run it as a Windows service. Okay, so that's something we need to set up separately. But before we do that, before we run it as a Windows service, we also need to create the console related classes. So if we're running it not from the console, so it's not a command prompt app, and it's running as a Windows service, it's going to use the startup file where it will go and register the NKit services and register your services, your own services here, etc., etc. But if we're running it from the command prompt and we want to see what it's doing, then we need to set up a console app class to do that, and a console app launcher. You see, so if the arguments passed into the application says like, run as console, then we will need to have that set up. Okay. And as part of doing that, we do the configure NKit services and configure in stock, or rather your own application services. You're going to do that separately here. So it's not going to use the startup file that we set up. The startup file is only if it's running as a Windows service. Okay, so register your own services here. Okay, cool. So let's create these console classes. So I'm going to create a console class over there. Let's say add new console. Okay, and I'm just going to copy and paste this that we have over there. Okay. So the console app will be registered as another service, just like all the other services. But it's registered as a singleton because it's once off instead of transient. So you can read up about the way to register services online, but singleton basically means you have a single instance of this service across the lifespan of your application. Whereas if you register transient, I think it's transient, add transient, then that service instance will be created every time you want it. Okay. So anyway, let's clean up this this console app class. Okay. So these are the different options I can pass in if I'm running from the command prompt. Okay. I'm going to rename this to crude API service. This is what you'll see in the command prompt. Okay. And just like all the other services, it asks for these settings and services that we've registered. These are all the NKit services that have been registered. Okay. And then what we also need is a console app launcher that's actually going to launch the service. So we're registering the service over here, right? So we say configure console app services. So we register the console app, but then we need to launch it. Okay, and the launcher is a separate class that we're going to create. We're going to call this console app launcher. Okay, and let's have a look at what this thing does behind the scenes. Okay, so what it does is it accepts the console app, an instance of the console app, okay, which got registered here. So we register this as a singleton that's available through .NET Core in the dependency injection container. So when we create the console app launcher, it will ask for an instance of that, okay, from the dependency injection container. Okay, so there we have it. And then finally, this use Windows service thing, we need to install a separate NuGet package for that. And this is the NuGet package that you're going to need, the Microsoft extensions.hosting.windows services. Okay, so we're going to look up that package. So we're going to say dependencies, add there. Okay, let's look for that. Okay, and we're going to install that. So that allows us to host the Kestrel web server as a Windows service. Okay, and that's it. Now there's no more errors. Right, okay, so we've got our application, everything is set up. Now, finally, we get to our actual REST API. So this is all the setup that was needed to put like the boilerplate code together. And now we are going to create a folder called controllers. Okay. And in there, it seems like we already have a controllers folder, so we just need to say include in folder and then hide the other files again, show all files. Okay, so in this, here we're going to say create a new controller, and we are going to call it maybe the user, or no, let's call it crude API controller. Okay. Okay, cool. So, in order to use some of the basic crude functionality that's already available from NKit, we need to inherit from the NKit crude controller. So it's NKit Web API crude controller. Okay, and what it's expecting is the DB repo. Okay, there we go. So we need to tell it which database repository to use for the basic crude functionality. Then we also need to set up the constructor, the default constructor. So when we get a web request, an instance of this API controller will be created. Okay, and let's have a look at this controller from an existing application. Okay, so in the same way, I set that up, and then on this iLogger, you need to put in the name crude API controller to set the context for it. Okay, cool. Let's just clean that up a bit. All right, great. So we've set up our API controller. Now we also need to give it a root. Okay, so the root tells us on which URL we can access this controller, right? So it's going to be made up of, it's going to be this URL, okay? It's going to be the host URL, that / API / the name of the controller. And in this case, the name of the controller is this. So the URL will be, let's put it into Notepad. The URL will be that / API / crude API. So when people access this REST API, this is how they will access it. Okay, cool. And that's basically our web service. Let's just have a look at what else we would need. Okay. Now, what you can also do is you can, on your controller, you can ask for other services or custom services that you've registered. In our case, we don't have that. And what's also pretty cool is, as part of the NKit, this API controller, you can also register for certain events. Like in this case, I can go this on before delete, on after delete, you know, on before put, after put, etc., etc., etc. You can hook onto these events as they happen, and you can do certain things. So like maybe on before delete, you can add an event. Okay. So in here, you could then go and check what entity ID is it, what entity name is, etc., etc. So the basic crude functions that occur on the API through NKit will fire these events, and you can customize to do certain things, like you want to maybe cancel the event, like you can go and check maybe if the entity name is user, don't allow the delete, and you can do that by saying cancel, like that, right? And then it will cancel the event. So the NKit framework underneath the hood will cancel the event and not allow you to delete that record. So that's just an example, right? Okay, but I'm not going to do any of that here. So to give you some examples on before put in my other application, I check for a certain type of record, and if it's this, then I cancel the event. I don't allow it to save or something like that. All right, cool. What else can we do? I think that's pretty much it in terms of the setup. Okay. One final thing that we need to do is set up the default URL when we run this application. Okay, and so you just need to tell you need to create a profile and tell it which URL to launch when I click run on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste from here. Okay, and I'm going to do that and do that. Okay, and I'm going to call this crude API. Okay, so what I'm saying is when I run this configuration, it must launch this URL. So that's the URL that our app is going to run on, 5006. Okay, cool. So that should be it, really. We should be able to run our application. So let's try and do that now. So you'll see now that it opens up a command prompt, and there we go. So this is the Kestrel server busy running, okay? So we can see all the web requests coming in, etc., etc. So this is our API. And now you can also see all the different actions available. So you can say get entity, delete, entity, crude API, etc. So all of these actions that you see here that are available are coming from NKit. So if we go into our code, we go back to that mobile controller, you see we haven't written any code here. And yet we have all these actions available to us to get, delete, get the entire table, put a record which saves or inserts or updates a record, the post does an inserts into a table, the delete, etc., etc. It has all of that in place now, and without us having written any code in terms of managing this process, without us having written a single line of code to create, read, update, or delete, it's all available here, right? The only thing that we haven't done is create the table in the database. So if we go into SQL Server, you'll see that the database has already been created. Just as we ran the app, the database was created. However, we don't have a table in here yet. So to do that, we need to create a migration. All right. So we're going to go in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Package Manager console. All right. and we're going to point it to our data project, because that's where we want the migrations to be created. So the migration is basically a script that's going to go and create the tables. So it's going to create the user table based on the model over there. So it's going to go and create a table with these fields. So we're going to say add migration. We're going to call it init, initialize, right? And when I hit enter, it's going to create the migration. And what it's doing behind the scenes is that it's looking at the app settings. So it pulls the app settings using the NKit settings that have been registered and so on, and it uses this connection string to connect to the database that it's already created, right? And then it's going to go and generate a script to create the tables that we need. So let's try that out. Hopefully the demo gods are not against us today. Oh, it looks like they are. All right, so let's do some troubleshooting. It seems like we haven't enabled migrations. So we're going to use the enable migrations command to enable migrations on this project. No context data type found in assembly CRUD API. Okay, let's just check that we have all the required. I didn't install any of the entity framework libraries, packages, because NKit already has these. But let's make sure we have all the required dependencies here. So we're going to try and create these ones. So we're going to install the tools, entity framework tools. Okay, this might take a bit of time. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, so it looks like we should be able to just say add migration according to the error message init build failed. Let's have a look. DB set. Okay. Okay, so it seems to be ambiguous with this. I'm going to remove that there. Let's try and build it, because we want to use the DB set from entity framework, not db.data. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, so it looks like we're using entity framework core tools 5 over here, but NKit core is using 5. I mean, we're using 9 over there, but we're using 5, so we might need to just upgrade. Okay, let's give that a go again, hopefully. Okay, so it's running. Let's try this again. Okay, so it looks like based on the errors, you just need to run a compatible entity framework version. So what I've done behind the scenes, I didn't want to waste your time watching it, but I've basically installed Entity Framework 7, 7, 7.1, etc. On all the Entity Framework, and these are the ones you need to install. So Entity Framework Core, 7.0.1, etc. So I will be upgrading the NKit library to use a later version. At the moment, if you look at NKit, it's actually using Entity Framework version 5. So what I've done is I installed Entity Framework 7, which overrides the the one the default one on NKit core. Okay. So in any case, now this basically works. So if we go add migrations, what it will do is it will create a migrations folder, and it will create the migration to set up the database. Okay, so here we go. Here's our migration. And as you can see, it's going and creating all the tables. So these are default tables that are part of NKit. So NKit logs all the responses, exception responses, etc., etc. The user table, and so on and so forth. Okay. All right. So lastly, what we need to do is run the app. And when we run the app, what it's going to do is it's going to run and update the database with this new migration. So it's going to bring the database up to speed with the latest migration. So if we have a look here, there's our migrations. And if we go into the startup class over here, and we search for update database, you see over here, this is where we told it to use our DB repo to update the database. And so it's at this point over here that it goes and it creates the database and so on. So under the hood, NKit will create the database and make sure it's got all the values required and run your migrations. Okay. Now, another way of doing it to test would be to go here and say update database. Okay, so now it's going to run the migration, update the database. And if we go back into SQL Server and we do a refresh, we have a look, there we go. We've got our new tables that have been created for us. And let's have a look if we've got those users in the table. Yes, we do. Okay. And if we now run the app, we should be able to use the data. Okay, so here's our API. And if I, for example, say, what are we going to do? Let's say, okay, I'm going to try this one out. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to put in the name of the entity, which in this case is user. And I'm going to search by username. And I'm going, what users have we got there? We got default and admin. So I'm going to search by admin. And I'm going to click execute. And there we go. We've got our response back. And we've got one record in there, which is admin. So yeah, that's pretty much it. You can use all the other different methods. If you want to do a delete, you can just provide the name of the class and delete all the records in that table. Not sure if you really want to do that. There's also a delete to delete by a specific entity ID. So you can go and put in the name of the table, which is user, and you're going to plug in this user ID in there and execute, and it will delete it. Okay, so yeah, that's basically it. So like in our example where we did a get by a specific user, it gives us what the URL would be. Okay, so I could even paste the sample URL in my browser and it should be able to give me something. Yeah, there we go. So it's given us the JSON back of the query. So this is exactly what a consumer of your API would do. They would call that URL and they would get the response back. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, okay. You can also do like a count. So you can say, I want to count, tell me how many records are in this table. Okay, I might have to double check this. I might have to double check this action method. All right, but in any case, that's basically how you do it. So if you want to now go and let's say we wanted to add another table, maybe you go and you create another table. All you need to do is you go into models. I don't know, what other class are we going to, maybe order number, right? We're going to do that. And we're going to do a similar thing to this. We're going to go and create another order. Okay. And we're going to go key, required, public, good, order ID, and we're going to do order number and date created, and we'll say this is also required. Okay, and what we'll do is we'll say string length maybe 200 instead of the default 250. And to use that datetime, we need to inherit from NKit base model. Okay, so now we've got our new table. And then to add it to our database, all we need to do is go to DB repo over here and add it over there. So we'll go virtual, DB set, order table, and maybe add an index, table indexes. Okay, so we'll go order, order number. And we say that's unique as well. Okay, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So to update the database, all we need to do is, oh wait, let's add like let's seed it, okay? So we're going to seed this and we're going to say private voice seed order to create a sample order. We're going to say model builder out order. Okay, and I'm going to say order, create a new order. Order ID, create a new good. Order number, we're going to call it purchase order 123. Date created is datetime dot now. Okay, seed order, and let's hook that up. Oh, and then finally we need to add it to the model builder. Entity order has data order. Okay, that's it. And then we need to call that method here. So we're going to say seed order, model builder, out, order, just like that. Okay, so we've registered our table. We just need to add a migration now. So we're going to create another migration, add migration, order table, add order table. Okay, so there we go. So now it's created a new migration. Okay, now if you go and you have a look at SQL Server over here, we haven't updated the database yet, right? So if we look into the migrations table, you'll see that the only migration we've added was the initial one. Okay, right. So now let's go and update the database. So what this will do is it will run this migration. You see, create table, blah, blah, blah. We'll run that on the database. So if we do a refresh in SQL Server, we should see this table now. Okay, there it is. All right, and there's our new migration. So we know that the init migration and the add order table migration have been added to the database. And we can see we should have at least one record in here. Yes, we do, which is the order number. Okay, and if we go and we run the app, we can now query any of these. So let's see, maybe let's do a get. Get. Let's do a get. Query the order table. Search bar, order number. And I think we called it 1, 2, 3, if I'm not mistaken. 1, 2, 3. Okay, there it is. So, and there's your URL. All right. So this is the URL someone would be calling on your API. So you do that, and bang, you've got the record back. Right. So I mean, it's pretty basic, pretty simple, very very simple. The only thing from now on, you might want to add like custom API calls, obviously on your REST web service. So what you would do is let's have a look. Look at some examples here. Let's say yeah, so we would add something like this. You know, that's basically how you do an HTTP put, and you would say what it consumes and produces, XML or whatever. Yeah, that's basically it. So let's try and do an HTTP GET. Okay, so here's an example of an HTTP GET. So we might let's do that. So we'll write a function that says, you know, get first order actions, controller, custom actions. Okay. Okay. So this we need to qualify from NKit, just like that. Okay, and I'm going to say action results. Get first order. Okay. Or you might say get order by order number. Okay, let's say order number. All right. Let's have a look at some examples here. Okay, so HTTP get root, and then what you do is you're going to say order, and your URL might be, let's say, order number, just like that. Order number equals, like that. Okay, so that needs to be mapped to that. So whatever you pass into the URL is going to come in on your action method over there. All right, and what we also need to do is go catch exception, and as part of this API controller, we should have okay, so we've got a couple of other things you can do. You can handle the exception if you like. I'm just going to add this in there. Maybe add a helper method here. Helper methods. Okay. Okay. There I normally save it to the database if there's an error. Okay. But this basically, okay, just to simplify things, we're going to just do it like that. So what this does is it calls a base method on this NKit controller to handle the exception. And then finally, what we also want to do is we want to dispose the database context. Okay, and again, this happens on the base controller over here. So if we go into the method, you'll see that what it does is it checks if the DB context exists, and if it does, it disposes it to release any sort of resources. And the DB, and you might ask, well, where does that DB context exist? Well, it exists here, because when we create the API controller, when it gets constructed at runtime, it receives that DB repo from the dependency injection container, and we get that because we registered it. So remember, you've got your startup classes here, and you said register NKit services, and here it registered the default NKit services. So it registered this DB repo here. You see, that happened at the start of the application. So because it's registered, we will receive it when we receive an API call. So every time you receive an API call, this gets called. We receive the DB repo, a new one, because we registered it as transient. We receive a new one, and so now that DB repo is available to us. So all we need to do is basically do a query to find this order number using the DB repo. And to do that, we're going to go into the DB repo. What I normally like to do is DB let me just see what my normal convention is like. Okay. But okay, never mind. I'll just put it in here so you can see it. Okay, so in this DB repo that we've set up, I'm going to make this a partial class so that I can spread it out in multiple class files. So I'm going to create a new one call it DB repo orders, right? And all my queries regarding the orders are going to sit in here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it exactly like that, partial. And so this is the same class, just extended across another file. And over here, I'm going to set up a method, region method, public void. Okay, what I'm getting back is an order, get order by order number, string order number. Okay, and here I'm going to do my query, result from O in set order. So this is a link to SQL query where O order number is equal to that. Okay. And a nice function here as part of the DB context is you can convert it to lower to flatten it. So I'm going to say order number is equal to that order number. Okay. So all it does is it trims the beginning and end of the string, and it converts it to lowercase, so that I can do a lowercase comparison here to lower. Select O first or default. So if it exists, it will return the record. Otherwise, it returns a null. Then I'm going to say return results. Okay, and then, so this is my database query. Okay, now in the controller, in my API, web service API, I'm going to get the DB context, which exists underneath the hood, in the base class that exists there, right? And then I'm going to say get order by order number. I'm going to pass in the order number, okay? And the result should be an order, okay? Now I just need to qualify that, okay? And finally, I need to log the web response, okay? So again, this is a base class method on the API controller. So what it does is it logs it to the Windows event log, to the text file, if you have those settings enabled in your app settings. All these logging settings here. Yeah, so if you have these enabled, it will log it, and you'll even see the response coming through. Okay. Then what I also like to do is do some validation. So I'm going to make, this is the request that's coming through. Log web request. Okay, I'm not going to log the web request. I'm only going to log the response, which is the order. Okay. Okay. Okay, then finally we need to set that up like that. Okay, in case there's an exception, we're not going to return anything, we're just going to throw it. Okay, now if we run this app, let's have a look if we can call this. So I'm going to try and put a breakpoint on there. Okay. And I'm going to put in the order number. It's PO123. Oh, you see, so it's created it. It exists, as you can see. This is a new action. And if I click execute, there it hits the breakpoint. And what I've typed in exists in my parameter because it's been mapped that way. And here it goes and runs the query. Let's see, did it return something? Yes, it did. logs the web response. So there we go. So you can see on the console, there's the web response, the actual order, and finally we return it. Boom. So you can have a look here. That this is our response. So your URL is there. And so anybody using this URL will just go, would implement that. They hit the thing, and it should work. Okay, maybe I need to double check what's going on here. But yeah, that's basically all there is to it. Yeah, I think I had I stopped the console by clicking on it. That's the problem. So if I do that, wait, sorry, if I grab this URL here and I paste it, boom, you see it hits my breakpoint, boom, 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 and there we go. So that's it. It's as simple as that to create a web service. So as you can see, I mean, it hasn't been long. It's like an hour and a half to do all of this, and that's with explanation. You know, if I didn't have to explain this to you, I would probably bang this out like in minutes. Well, maybe not minutes, like half an hour. Could probably get it done in half an hour. And by the way, these are custom, right? But you know, I can still query any table I want, any table that exists in the database. I can query it using these base methods provided by NKit. Yeah. So as you saw, I didn't write a single line of code to query the order or the user. I only did this one as an example for you. All right. So that's pretty much all there is to it.